how to sew the Snowdrop tote with Amber Makes. Make this beautiful bag and celebrate the joy of the first snowdrops. Follow me and I'll show you how. Cutting out. Take the fabric panel from your kit and give it a good press. If you lay it right sides up, you can see that all the pieces are printed on the panel with a label above each one. I'm showing you all the pieces here. You can see you've got the centre front outer, the front right side outer, you've got straps, the bases, and you've also got some extra pieces that you can use, such as gift tags and a label, and small snowdrops that you can use for your own makes. You'll also have a piece of lining fabric in your kit. You'll need some wadding or some foam interfacing such as bosal if you want to strengthen it, and a magnetic clasp if you want to hold it closed at the top. Once you've cut out all the pieces, make sure that you pin the label that's above it to the top of the right-hand side of each piece, and then you'll remember which piece is which during assembly. Only take them off after you've sewn the bag together. So you can see here, everything is labelled from the panel, and I've pinned the labels to the top of the right side of each piece. And put them all into a panel and then into a pile, and then you can take them and use them as you sew. Here's the two strap pieces. You've got two for the strap outer and two for the strap lining. Once you've done that, you now need to cut out the lining piece. The extra pieces on the panel you can use for your own makes or to decorate your bag if you wish. I've pressed the lining fabric and then cut it out following the instructions and the measurements that you'll find in the printed instructions which come with your kit. Make sure you follow these exactly so that you cut the lining out to the right sizes. So the front lining and the back lining, and then the pocket lining. Making the front and back outer. Place the front right side outer, right sides facing on top of the centre front outer. So you see I've placed this on the right. Now place it right sides facing, so if you fold it over and make sure that the raw edges match at the top and the bottom and the sides, and then pin it together at one end and pin it together at the other end, and then pin it together between those two pins. By pinning at the top and bottom like this and then pinning, it makes sure that the top and bottom match up. Now take the front left side outer and place that right sides facing on the other left side of that centre outer, just like this. So you're framing the centre outer with the two side outers. And pin together at the top and the bottom, and then pin together between. Now sew these two pieces in position either side from the top to the bottom. Once you've sewn it, it will look like this, and you can see I've pressed the seams over towards the side outers just to make it look neater. Now take the front base outer and you need to sew that along the bottom edge of those joined pieces at the top. So place them right sides facing so the bottom edge of the centre front outer and side outers meets the top edge of the base outer. Again, pin them together at either end, making sure that the side and the top raw edges meet up. And then you can pin together between. Just give it a little pull because these pieces have been measured to fit exactly, but because you've got seams in the top piece where the centre outer is joined on, it sometimes pulls the fabric in a little bit. So just give it a little pull and it will fit exactly. So I like to place pins in where the seams are, and that just holds them flat so that I make sure when I sew over them they stay pressed over as I've done them earlier. Now sew these pieces together all the way along the top edge. Once that's done, you have completed the front outer, and you can see I pressed that seam towards the base. Now to make the back outer, you need to take the back outer and the back base outer, place them right sides facing so that the bottom edge of the back outer meets the top edge of the back base outer, because the base is obviously sitting below it. Pin it together at either end as you did before, and then making sure, just adjust it slightly to make sure that those raw edges match up. pin it together between these end marks. Always making sure as you do it that the raw edges stay matching up, and then sew these two pieces together. Once that's done, it will look like this, and then you can see I've pressed the seam down towards the base outer. So that's the front and back outer, now finished. Making the pocket. Take the pocket outer and the pocket lining and place them right sides facing. Make sure that the raw edges match up all the way around. They're the same size, so they will, but I still like to pin together in the corners and then pin between. Just because sometimes when you're cutting and pressing, it can distort the fabric a little bit. So if you make sure that the corners fit, then everything will fit up nicely. And then pin it together. I pinned across the top, down the side. Now pin it together along the bottom edge. And then pin it together at the other side. Now you need to leave a turning gap in the bottom edge to turn this pocket right sides up. So I'm just popping a pin in to hold the fabric in place. Then take your tape measure. Make sure that you've got the bottom edge, so you can turn it over to the other side, you can see. Take the tape measure and mark a point that's in the centre of that bottom edge, and then mark 2 inches either side of this centre, and that marks a 4-inch turning gap. Now you need to sew it together starting at one side of the turning gap all the way around and stopping at the other side of the turning gap so it's left unstitched. Then fold the seams over just to one side and give them a press. This will help them to lay on the edge later. And with the turning gap, fold the seam allowances over and press them on both sides, and this holds the turning gap pressed under. Now to reduce the bulk in the corners, snip across the corner and then grade the seams by cutting off a small triangle of fabric close to the corners. It just means if you reduce the bulk in the corners, rather than having rounded corners on your pocket, you will have nice, sharp, right-angled corners. But do take care when you're trimming these not to cut into the stitching. If you do by accident, just pop it back under your sewing machine and restitch any stitching that you have done. Now, put your fingers inside the turning gap and turn the pocket right sides out. Push your fingers into each of the corners to just push them out to start with. Just like this. The turning gap is big enough so that you can get your hand inside to do this. Now you need to use a pointed but not sharp object to just push the corners out. I tend to use the stick for my turning tube, but there are specialist turning tools available or pointing edge tools that you can use just to push out the corners, but make sure it's nothing too sharp. Now roll the seam between your fingers to make sure it lays right on the edge and give it a press. Because you pressed the seam over to one side before you turned it right sides out, this is easier. So make sure the seam lays right on the edge and give it a press. If you have any problems at all getting it to lay nice and flat, just spray it with a little water or steam and press it, and that will hold it flat. Make sure the edges of the turning gap still stay turned under, adjusting them if not, and press along that edge. I like to press the turning gap from both sides to make sure it's all pressed under. Now top stitch along the top edge to decorate it and hold it flat. I've worked 2 lines of top stitching just for decoration, and that finishes off the pocket really neatly. Finishing the outers. If you want to add some extra structure to your bag, you can use wadding for a slightly padded look or foam interfacing such as Bosal for a more structured look. You don't have to use this though, but if you want to, place the front and back outers that you stitched earlier onto the wadding. Space them a little bit apart and smooth them out so they're nice and flat, or onto the foam interfacing. Now if you're using fusible wadding or interfacing, then press it into place. If you're using non-fusible, then tack it into place all the way around the edges. Then you can quilt it. You can see on the front outer I quilted along all the wavy lines on the base, and then I also quilted around the vase, just to give it a little bit of extra structure and detail. And on the back outer, I just quilted along the wavy lines on the base. But you can quilt whatever pattern you want. Now once that's done, you can then add the pocket. If you're not using wadding or interfacing, then just carry on add the pocket. Measure 1/2 inch up from the seam that joins the back outer to the back base outer and mark that with a pin. I'm just marking it in a couple of places because this is where the bottom edge of the pocket's going to go. So mark your 1/2 inch marks. You can use pens or an erasable pen for this, and then place the pocket centrally across the back outer. Measure this carefully to make sure it's central. Then when you're happy it's central, you can pin it into place. To be certain that it's straight, I also like to double check by just measuring the gap where the top of the pocket meets the top of the back outer, and you can adjust that if not. But take the time to make sure that it is central and placed 1/2 inch at the bottom, and then your pocket will look more even. Once you've done that, you can then pin the pocket to the back outer all the way round. Make sure it stays still and that it stays central. Now sew the pocket into place by sewing down the side, across the bottom and up the other side. If you want to divide your pocket into sections, then you can stitch a vertical line through them. I've wanted to keep my pocket just a big open pocket, so I've left it like that. Now to join the front outer and the back outer together, place them right sides facing. Make sure you match up the raw edges at the top and the bottom, and also double check the seam where you've joined the bases on matches up exactly, because when you've made your bag, this seam will sit on the side, and so if those base wavy line sections meet up exactly, you'll just get a neater finish. It doesn't matter too much, but I always find if you pin those together before you pin the rest, then it just joins up nicely. Now rearrange it to make sure those raw edges are matching up, particularly if you've used wadding or a foam interfacing. It can shift slightly, so make sure the raw edges are matching up down the sides. You don't need to pin around the cut-out corners, you just need to pin along the base. So again, make sure the side and the raw edges match up. Pin together at either end first, and then pin between those pins. And again, match up that seam where the base joins the front and the back outer, and put a pin there to hold it, and then you can pin at the bottom edge and the top edge. Again, you don't need to pin around those cut-out corners. And pin at the top edge and then pin between. Now sew the two together down the side, not around the cut-out corner, along the bottom, not around the next cut-out corner, and along the top. So once that's done, you can see I've left the cut-out corners open and unstitched, and I've left the top edge open and unstitched. So that's the front and backs joined. I'll put that aside for now. Making the lining. Take the front lining and the back lining and place them right sides facing. Make sure that the two top edges are at the top and the bottom cut-out corners are at the bottom. And then rearrange them so that all the raw edges are matching all the way around. Now pin them together down one side, again, in the same way as you did with the outers. Match up the one edge and then the top end, and then pin them together, just rearranging it to make sure the raw edges match up, and pin between. Then pin together across the bottom edge. Again, this is the same way as you did when you joined the outer pieces together. You don't need to pin around the cut-out corners. Now you need to leave a turning gap unstitched in the bottom of this edge. So measure and mark the centre, and then mark 2.5 inches either side of this centre mark, and that leaves a 5-inch gap, which is going to be the turning gap that you'll leave unstitched. And once you've done that, then you can pin it together up the other side. Again, make sure that the raw edges match up and the top and the bottom edges. and then your lining will fit nice and neatly inside the outer when you assemble the bag later. Once that's done, stitch it together down the side, not round the cutout corner, along the bottom, but leave that turning gap unstitched. So make sure you reverse stitch either end of that seam to make it secure, and then up the other side. And once it's done, it will look like this. Now I've pressed these seams open. It will help them to lay flatter later. And also along the bottom edge, make sure you press that seam open so that the turning gap edge is pressed over, and it will help when you join it all together later. Now turn the lining right sides out. We're going to add a magnetic snap here. You don't have to do this. This is optional. It's only if you want to hold the bag closed. So if you don't want to add a magnetic snap, you can just leave out this step. So make sure the seams are lying right on the edge and the lining is laying nice and flat. On the front lining side, it doesn't matter, they're exactly the same. Measure to find the centre and mark that. Now you need to measure and mark 1.5 inches down from the top. So the hole that's in the centre of the back plate of the magnetic clasp needs to be 1.5 inches down from the top. So just make a little dot. And then I'm just going to double check that's still in the centre. Place the hole of the back plate over the dot you've marked, and then draw through those 2 little vertical slits and then take them off. Now take a 1.5 inch square of wadding or a thicker piece of fabric if you don't have one, and place the back plate in the centre and again draw through those vertical slits. Now a seam ripper is ideal for this. Most sewing machines come with them, or a tiny pair of scissors. Push the end of the seam ripper through and just cut along those slits. Make sure you're only cutting through the front lining and not into the back lining, and do the same with your little piece of wadding or fabric. This just helps the magnetic snap to not get pulled through. It just makes it extra secure. Now take the male section of your magnetic snap and push the prongs through the little slits that you've cut so they come through to the wrong side of the lining, and then take that piece of wadding and place it over and push the prongs through the slits. Now take the back plate of your magnetic clasp, put it over the prongs, and you can see how that wadding now protects the fabric and makes the snap more secure, and then press the prongs over like this, and then that's the male half joined to the front lining. Turn it over to the back, and we're going to put the female half on it in exactly the same way. Now I've already marked this in advance, but again make sure the hole is 1.5 inches down from the top and that it's centrally placed. Take another piece of wadding, because you're going to secure this. Place the back plate on top, draw the little lines, then you can cut the slits that you've marked earlier. Make sure that you're careful when you cut these, that they're only the same length as you've drawn. You don't want them bigger or the clasp won't be as secure. And then cut the little slits in the wadding. Now take the female heart section of your magnetic clasp, push the prongs through the slits that you've cut. Place the wadding on top, push the prongs through the slits in the wadding. Take the back plate, place that over the prongs and fold the prongs inwards so that they're on top of each other, and that will secure the clasp. Now you can see you've attached the female and male section of the clasp. Now what I like to do now, before I assemble the whole bag, is turn it wrong sides out and just make sure that the clasp, when joined close together, is in the right place so they meet up. Because if you've got it in the wrong place and you've assembled the bag, it's difficult to change at that stage. So if you've measured carefully, then it will definitely meet up, but it is always worth checking. Making the straps. Take one strap outer and one strap lining. You can remove the labels because you won't need these now, and place them right sides facing. Make sure all the raw edges match up and pin them together. The straps are exactly the same size, so they will fit together. Pin them together at one end and then pin them together at the other end. Because they're long straps, it's much better to pin at either end than pin between so that the fabric doesn't shift if you're pinning. Just rearrange them to make sure that the raw edges are matching up, and then pin together down one long edge Then pin them together down the other long edge. Turn it around, because I always like to make sure that I pin so that the ends of the pins are facing away from the direction I'm sewing. It's much easier to take them out as you're sewing if the ends of the pins are facing towards you. So that's why I pin in one direction and then I turn the strap round and pin it in the other direction. Take time to pin these together because the fabric can shift a little bit as you're stitching, and it just helps to keep them together and you'll get a neater finish. Once you've pinned them, sew them together all the way down one long edge and then all the way along the other long edge to make a tube. Once that's done, press those seams open and flat. It will help them to lay on the edge later. They're in the centre just because it's easier. Now I'm going to use a turning tube to turn this right sides out, so I've tacked it together across one end. If you don't have a turning tube, then you'll just have to turn it right sides out carefully, but a turning tube makes this so much quicker and easier. So push the plastic tube inside, take the stick, and then push the end, which is why I've tacked it together, up through the tube. And even though it's a long strap, it will go all the way through. And then take the other end and then pull the strap, and that turns the whole thing right sides out. Now remove the tacking stitches that you put in the end if you've used your tube. If you make sure that I always work my tacking stitches by machine using the longest stitch length on my machine, just because it's only to hold it together and it makes it a lot easier to undo the tacking if you do that. Now make sure both ends are pulled right sides out, and then roll those seams between your fingers and press them flat. Do take the time here to make sure that it's flat and those seams lay right on the edge. It will look like this once it's all pressed flat. So you can see the seams are right on the edge and it's really neat. Now to neaten and decorate, top stitch down both long edges of the strap. This just gives a much neater finish, a more decorative one, or you could use a decorative stitch on your machine if you prefer, but it gives a real professional looking strap. Then repeat this to make the other strap in exactly the same way, using the other strap outer and the other strap lining piece. Assembling the bag. Take the joined front outer and back outer and place them right sides up, making sure that the seams lay right on the edge and you've got the bottom at the bottom. Now you're going to start with one strap and place that on the front outer. Now the strap needs to placed the outer edge of it 3 inches in from the side seam, but that's actually where the front outer section is. Place the strap right sides down so that the left hand side of it runs along that seam that joins the centre to the sides, and then position the end of the strap so it extends a 1/2 inch above the top edge of the bag. This just makes it extra secure and stops it being pulled out. Making sure the strap is lying nice and straight, pin it together a couple of inches further down than that, and that will just hold it straight when you're assembling it. Make sure you only pin through the front, so remove your pins if you've done like I've done and pin through to the back. Now take the strap, run it through your fingers, making sure it lays straight, and position the outer edge of it so it lines up with the side outer piece. And again, make sure that the short end of the strap extends a 1/2 inch above the top of the bag. So making sure that the strap lays nice and straight and the outer edge of it lines up with the side outer, pin it together at the top and then pin it together a couple of inches further down to make sure it stays straight. Because sometimes when you sew a strap into place, if you don't put this second line in, it can go wonky. Now tack it together across the top and then a bit further down where you put those second pins. Once that's done, it will look like this, so it's all tacked into place. Pin and tack the other strap to the back of the bag, making sure that the outer edge of the strap is 3 inches in from the side seams of the bag, and then you can double check that they match up at the top. Now take the lining, with the lining wrong sides out, place the outer inside the lining, and then they'll be right sides facing. Match up the side seams at the top. So the side seam of the outer and the side seam of the lining need to be right sides facing. And make sure those seams are lying nice and open and flat as well, because you're going to be sewing through all these layers. So if you've got the seams laying open, then you won't have as many layers to go through. So pin them together at that side seam and then work your way round to pin at the other side seam. You always pin at the side seams first because it makes sure the lining sits properly inside the bag and isn't twisted at all. These are your sort of anchoring points, because then you can pin together between them, but this just makes sure the lining is in the right place. Once you've done that, you can now pin the lining to the outer. Make sure that the raw edges of the top of the lining and the raw edges of the top of the outer match up exactly, and you can see now that the ends of the straps stick up beyond. When you've got a lot of items in your bag, if you're carrying heavy things, it can pull the straps out if you have them right on the end because it pulls through the fabric fibres, but this extra ½ inch just gives it some added security. So pin it together along one side and then all the way along the other side, making sure that the raw edges match up, because the lining and the outer is the same size, so if the raw edges don't match it, you'll end up with a slightly uneven looking bag. So just take the time to just adjust it and pin it together here. If you don't take the time to do this, when you sew it together, everything can start shifting and then the lining doesn't lay straight. So once you've pinned it together, sew it together all the way around the top edge. And then it will look like this. So now you've sewn the lining to the top of the bag. Now open out the two pieces, but keep the wrong sides out. Don't turn the right sides out yet because we've got to box the corners in the next step. So they need to be laying nice and flat and laying wrong sides out. Take the time at this point to open up that seam that you've just sewn and press it open and flat. This seam needs to lay on the edge of the top of the bag later, so if you take the time to press it now, it will lay flatter when you do it later. Boxing the corners. The corners of the outer lining are boxed together at the same time, as it makes it neater. So to box one outer corner, place the side seam and the base seam on one side, so they're right sides facing, and make sure that those two seams match up. I like to do that by pushing a pin through one seam and then making sure it comes through the seam on the other side. So you've got the side seam of the bag, right sides facing with the base seam. Pin it together so the seams match up and then pin together across the seam. And then you can make sure it matches up. You can then take in those positioning pins. Now make sure that that corner is lying nice and flat. I'm going to clip it together because I've got wadding in it, so it's quite bulky, but you can pin it if you prefer. Pin it together all the way along that top edge, and then you can remove that placement pin. And then making sure those corners stay nice and angled, pin together a little bit further down, and that holds it nice and flat. That's one corner boxed but clipped. Repeat that to box the other outer corner in the same way. Then move over to the lining and do exactly the same. Match up the side seam with the base seam and pin it together, and then match up the side seam and the base seam. I've just pinned the lining rather than clipping it. Now take the outer and that seam, follow it along with your finger all the way along the lining to the other box corner and fold them like this so that the seams are facing each other. Now match up the seam that you matched on the outers with the seam that you've matched on the linings. Make sure the seams match up exactly and then pin or clip it together. And then do that all the way along the edge so that the raw edges match up. Remember to take out the pins from the lining as you do this, because you're going to be sewing all these layers together and you don't want the pins in. But it's easier to pin each corner one at a time and then pin them together. So do remember to take out the pins as you go. And then pin or clip them down the side. Just turn it over to make sure everything's laying nice and flat, and then sew together all the way along this edge. And it will look like this, and this is one corner box now, but you can see that the lining is sewn to the outer, so the lining will stay inside the bag. Now do the other corner in the same way. Follow that seam with your finger along the outer, along the lining, and then take hold of the lining and fold them together so that the seams are matching and pinned together. Now, if you prefer, you can actually box each corner of the lining, the outer, one at a time, and then sew them together within the seam allowance. Obviously, this takes a bit longer as you're sewing lots more seams. It depends how you feel, but I find this quite easy to do. Just remember to take out the set of pins from the other side as you go. and make sure that the side seams match up. But if you followed it along with your finger and then fold it so the seams are matching, then it will all lie nice and neatly. And again, don't forget to clip it down the sides as well. That just helps to keep everything laying flat and you don't get any of the extra lining caught in this seam. So once you've done that, sew all those layers together across the edge. And now you've boxed both corners of your outer and your lining, and the lining will stay right inside the bag and won't come up, and you'll get a much neater, more structured finish. There's the turning gap you can see. So it looks like a bit like a pasty, and you're ready for the next stage. Finishing off. Now you've boxed your corners. Turn the whole bag right sides out through the turning gap that you've left in the lining. If you've used wadding or bosal, it's a little bit stiffer to get through, but the gap is big enough for you to ease it through. Just do it gently and gradually because you don't want to split the stitching, but if you just push it through very gently, working your way round like this, it will all turn right sides out through that gap you've left. So once the whole bag is turned right sides out through the wadding, you'll need to stitch the turning gap closed, but before you do that, just double check everything's in the right place. I always like to turn it right sides out just to make sure that when I've done the boxed corners, all the seams are laying nice and straight. It's a lot easier to adjust something now before you sew the turning gap. So just put your hands inside to make sure that the corners of those box corners that you've done, that the seams are laying right on the edge. It's easier to do that with your hands inside the bag now rather than later once you've sewn up the gap. So just make sure everything's laying nice and flat. And then when you're happy with it, turn it lining sides out. And where you've got the gap, the turning gap in the lining, pin that together. Now you've obviously pressed the edge of that under before, but because you've turned it right sides out, it might have moved it slightly. So if the edges aren't turned under and nice and neat, just give them a little press and then pin those turned under edges together. Make sure you only pin into the lining though, and don't catch any of the outer or any other sections of the lining. Once you've pinned it together, just top stitch together, or you can slip stitch by hand to close that turning gap and give it a press and it will look like this. Now the lining section is all finished, you can turn your bag right sides out. Push out those corners again, and you can see because you box the corners together, the lining is held right inside the bag. Now the next thing you need to do is remove that second set of tacking stitches, the ones that we put in earlier to hold the straps straight during assembly. If you've used a nice long tacking stitch on your machine, these are very simple and quick to remove with a sharp pair of scissors. So just take those out because the straps need to be facing upwards away from the bag. But you will have nice straight straps that are lying at right angles and not across the bag. So just take those out. Now the seam that lays across the top of the bag, you now need to press this so that it lays right on the top. But because you pressed it open earlier, that's a lot easier. So just roll it between your fingers and take the time here to press it so that the seam lays exactly on the edge so that you can't see any lining above the top of the bag. And then top stitch together all the way around, or use a decorative stitch. I worked one row of stitching 1/8 of an inch from the top and another row 1/4 of an inch below that. I just found that the 2 rows of stitching gave it a neater finish. And that's your bag now finished. You can see that the lining is held neatly inside the bag. To give it a bit of shape, what I like to do now is take one corner and the other corner and press that on both sides, and that creates that nice rectangular box bottom. So there's your bag finished. It's got a magnetic clasp, a pocket on the back, and it's all ready to take shopping and show off to your friends your beautiful Snowdrop tote.